Hi, everyone. I'm BJ. I'm the genealogy librarian at the Maine State Library. And tonight I'm going to continue my series on DNA. And tonight we'll talk about ethnicity estimates and about relatives and how you can use the relatives you find to find shared matches and figure out who you and your matches are descended from. So I'm going to go through all of this tonight, and then next week I'll have a little more of this, and then we'll get into the third-party tools that will help you do some of this more easily. So let me share my screen. And get everything set up here. That can't really get set up until we're live. Okay, looks like we're ready. Are you seeing my screen? Okay, good. All right, so quickly going over, last week we talked about the 3 types of DNA that are tested: Y-DNA, mitochondrial DNA, which are on the straight maternal and straight paternal lines. They change over a longer time frame. And so they're a little less useful. Y-DNA can be very useful in unknown parentage issues. So tonight we're going to talk about the autosomal DNA and the things you can learn from it. And just briefly remember, this is what you get from both your parents. It's the 22 chromosomes that aren't the X and the Y. Simplifying, but essentially you can go back about 5 to 7 generations before the recombining when 2 people produce a baby is filtered enough that you can't really necessarily draw conclusions with the data you get. So, so there are sort of 4 things you can do with this. And all of the companies do ethnicity, which I'm sure you've seen the commercials for, and relatives, which a lot of people don't realize they're going to get. And I will talk briefly about why that's a problem in a minute or a little while later. Ancestry does what they call genetic communities. And this is trying to narrow down the ethnicity within the last couple hundred years rather than looking over the last 1,000-year filter. And then 23andMe does some health checking for, do you have genes that could lead to breast cancer or Parkinson's and some things like that. Ancestry and 23andMe, you have to do the test with them to get results. You have to send them a sample. All of the others, you can download your data from another site and upload it to Family Tree DNA, MyHeritage, Living DNA. And so because of that, and because of the health aspect at 23andMe and the Ancestry having the largest database, many people who are trying to figure out unknown parentage from adoption or because their father's not or grandfather's not who they thought they were, test first and sometimes only at Ancestry or 23andMe. If you're in that pool, I would highly recommend doing both of them because there are some strengths and weaknesses with each website, and you get better information in some ways from one on some things and on other things from the other one. So just as a reminder, theoretically, you get half your DNA from each parent, and 1/4 of your DNA from each of your 4 grandparents. But because of the way things recombine when children are produced, you can get bigger chunks from one grandparent as opposed to the other. You get less variation on the half and half by parents, but when you start getting into looking at what you inherited from your grandparents or great grandparents, you can find some wide variation in how much you get. So let's talk a little about the ethnicity. Ethnicity estimates these days are very accurate to a great extent at the continental level. So if your test says you have 15% sub-Saharan African and 85% European, that's pretty close to accurate. Within Europe, I don't know enough about some of the others. You get different things with Asia, Africa, and the Americas. But within Europe, which is where most of us are going to be looking, you end up with some fuzzy borders, essentially. And so, if you get a result that says, you're 90% Eastern European of various sorts, that's probably right versus the 10% Southern European. But if you were expecting only Latvian and you get Latvian, Lithuanian, and Estonian, don't panic. It's just that people moved around. These are still estimates. Same thing with Norway and Sweden and Denmark. If you look at this map over here, you can see how close you get from Ireland to Southern Scotland and Northern England. I've had people wondering why, they were under the impression they were 100% Italian, but they get 80% other Mediterranean, or 80% Italian and 20% other Mediterranean. And they're wondering if it means their grandfather's not their grandfather. And I say, if you've got the family matches that prove he's your grandfather, you don't need to worry about the ethnicity, because people moved around. They are not digging up people from 1,000 years ago to do this. They are going to a DNA company goes and finds people in an area whose grandparents were all born in a 25 or 30 mile radius or circle, and takes that as typical of that area, which means, for example, that my aunt, my dad, if he were still alive, could be a Scottish reference population because all 4 of their grandparents were born in a little area in Scotland. But if you get to the great grandparent level, some of them were born over here in the northern part of Ireland, both Northern Ireland and Donegal in the Republic. And so you get that kind of mixing. The other thing is there are some endogamous groups. Endogamy means they marry within the group. So if you're dealing with French Canadian DNA, Eastern European Jewish, Ashkenazi Jewish, from certain island populations, Orkney, for example, which is here at the top of Scotland, there's a distinct genetic profile that goes with people who have deep Orkney roots that's different from either Shetland or the mainland of Scotland. Mennonite, Amish, Brethren, Hutterite groups tend to be endogamous as well. And so if you're dealing with a population like that, some of these tests may not be as helpful initially. You have to do more work to tease out what's going on. The same thing does happen with colonial New England ancestry. It's just for most of us, it's further back. In the last couple hundred years, there's not what's called pedigree collapse, where you get multiple generations of people marrying first through third cousins so that when you look at your tree, when you should have 32 great grandparents, you've only got 19 because people have married cousins. But if you are getting a funky answer, it may be that you've got partly a population that is endogamous and marrying within a group, or is isolated by being on an island, and things like that. So, within Europe, within these circles, things are pretty, as I said, they're going to catch Eastern European versus Irish. But, within Eastern Europe, if you, as I said, if you're expecting Latvian and you get Finnish, Estonian, Lithuanian, Belarusian as a jumble, don't panic. It doesn't mean that your grandparents were not who you thought they were. So keep that in mind. So the ethnicity estimates do get updated. These are various estimates from Ancestry, and they change. And so because it's hard to see this, the next slide is going to be a table, but I did want to point out here, you get these, you get the actual DNA estimates for your DNA with just a circle. The circles with the dotted lines around them are what they call genetic communities. And these are an attempt with dealing with your matches and where their ancestors were, and with who you match with on the tree side of things to narrow down. You see, within Scotland and Ireland, they tried to narrow it down to the Scottish Central Lowlands, which is the area, for those of you familiar with Scotland, that's really kind of the area from the capital cities and a little south, before you get to the English border. For the most part, you can, when you have 1% and 2% numbers, those are often noise. I'm going to show you one case where in my results, it may not be. But again, you're going to get, if you see something like this, where you just have 1% with a bunch of other, here there was 60%, 39%, and then 1%. And there's a good chance that 1% is often essentially background noise. And you don't want to go looking for an ancestor based on that, because it may not be a true good result. So I put the ancestry results in a table, and you can see, this is over a 3-year period. Their categories did change a little. For a while, they had England or Scotland and Ireland together. And in the latest update, they've split them out. They've only been selling their kits in Ireland and Scotland for about 5 years. So I'm guessing they're beginning to get enough data that they're able to pull these out now. This was actually Norwegian in one and Swedish in the other, but I lumped them under Scandinavian because, distinguishing one from the other is not necessarily feasible. And again, you can see things have changed. It's just that as their reference populations get better and they have more categories, they break them out. So that's why, you get the Scotland and Ireland, you get Wales broken out on this most recent one, and France broken out from Western Europe. The other thing that's going on here is that it is currently illegal to do direct to consumer DNA testing in most cases in France. So they're getting relatively few results. They're not getting the huge results they're getting for selling in the UK or in the US and Canada. The other thing that's tough here is that not only did you get lots of back and forth across the English Channel, the whole England being the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes coming from what's now Germany and Denmark. But it's not really, the tests aren't as illegal in the same way in Germany, but there's not, because of Germany's history, there's not a lot of wanting to take the tests. So again, you've got this big chunk in the middle of Europe where they're just not getting huge amounts of data. But again, if you do a test and your estimates change, don't panic, because they're just getting better at what they're doing and the science is evolving. So this is me at 23andMe, and you can see here, this was an early result, and it's a little deceptive because you look at this and you think I've got a lot of Eastern European ancestry, but what it is it's one of these tiny little lines here in the circle, and all of this is coming out of here, and I'm still mostly British Isles. And again, you can see this was from 2017 and this is 2019. And they've eliminated some of this, and they've differentiated some of these better. But then on the other hand, they've lumped sort of the continental Europe together, that they tried to break out here, and they probably really didn't have the data to do that. And again, they're also trying to come up with sort of those genetic communities. The Donegal is right. London, I'm not sure about. But again, you're looking at, you have to remember that they're not digging up people who were living in London in the year 1200. They're looking at people whose grandparents were all born in the London area, which may or may not be where the deep roots are. One of the things 23andMe does, they actually look at variants that are known to be Neanderthal. There was mixing between Neanderthals and early modern humans. And there's a tendency that the closer your ancestors are to the northwestern corner of Europe, the higher your Neanderthal ancestry is. There's the current theory, or at least the theory I read a couple years ago, and I haven't had a chance to check if they've changed, is that subsequent waves of immigration pushed the Neanderthals and those who had interbred with them out to the edge of Europe. So I'm way up there. Not everybody is. There is also some evidence that some of this is actually better for genetic health. But again, the science is evolving, and I don't want to say too much about it because next week another article could come out and change things completely. So here's looking at 3 different companies. This is 23andMe, this is Ancestry, and this is Family Tree DNA. And as you can see, I should have probably done the one where they break this out, but it's like 89% British Isles and 5% other. All 3 companies agree that I'm pretty much British Isles ancestry. What's interesting is, I was saying that this 1%, and this had been 1 to 2% at 23andMe until their most recent one that took it down to basically nothing, is coming up as Jewish or Peninsula Arab or Iberian Peninsula, West Baltic. It's different at each one of these services and each time. And I have a mystery ancestor who's at the level where he should be contributing 1 to 2% of my DNA. And so this may actually be a case where this little trace that's the 1 to 3% is actually from a particular ancestor. Both my brother and I have this trace. our dad's sister doesn't, which is in line with I'm thinking it's one of my mother's ancestors. Those of you who've heard me mutter about John T. Sears in the book that puts him in the wrong family, he's my mystery person who appears from nowhere. And it's looking like he's from Spain or Portugal. And so that may be what's coming up with this odd thing. Stay tuned. If I ever figure it out, I'm sure I'll make a program out of it. And then finally, the other thing that happens, these are from MyHeritage. I uploaded both my data and my brother's. And one of the questions I get the most frequently is when two siblings or parent and child get widely different ethnicity estimates. And the DNA shows their parent and child or that they're siblings, but they come in basically in a panic saying, does this mean that we're not full siblings? Or does this mean that my father's not my father because the ethnicity is off? And I can tell you, my brother and I test out as full siblings, actually at the high end of DNA shared for full siblings. And as you can see, on the same day, through the same service, family or MyHeritage agreed that we're basically 98 point something% European, but within that had very different results for me and my brother. And so this is a case where he's inherited different bits of DNA from me than I have, and they're reading the different bits slightly differently. It's often not worth doing a father and son or two brothers or two male cousins through the male line for Y-DNA. But because of this, if you're dealing with autosomal DNA, when you're dealing with testing, the idea is the more the merrier, because my brother has inherited DNA that I don't have from my parents. We'd be identical twins if we'd inherited the exact same DNA. And so there are cases where he has a connection, a match with a third, fourth, fifth cousin that I don't, because he inherited the same bit of DNA they did. Whereas with the random mixing, the recombining that is done pretty much completely randomly, I didn't get the piece of DNA that they share. Does that make sense to everybody? Why it is often worth testing. Although I would say if you can go with a parent, an aunt or uncle, or a first cousin over a sibling, because that will help you figure out which side matches are on. Because if someone matches me and my dad's sister, I know that that matches on my dad's side of the family. Now, obviously, if you have the money and everyone wants to have it done, having full siblings test is great, but it's not going to, getting a first cousin, an aunt, or a parent to test will help you do that sorting. Does that make sense to everybody? So, first cousin is often the best person to start with if you don't have a surviving parent or aunt or uncle. And so I had a surviving aunt, and I have now, several of my cousins have tested without me asking. I asked and paid for my aunts, and I manage her results. So again, showing that siblings can get different results when they show as siblings, but the ethnicity is different. So this is one of those things that people don't understand, that it's still science in progress, and I have had people panic over this, which is why I'm saying something about it to you. Now at 23andMe, they attempt to do a family tree if you have people close to you who have tested. This is actually 3/4 of my tree. I've cut my grandmother off, not because she was a pain to live with, but because there are people on her side of the family that were dealing with adoptions. And so for privacy, I cut them off. I put in a few of these names up here where there's not direct testing, but anyone whose last name is purpled out is someone who tested plus me. I figured you know who I am, so I didn't have to purple out my last name. And so you can see there's this entire cluster of people here who descend from one of my aunts, not the one who's still living, but 2 of her daughters have tested, and 3 of the grandchildren. This cousin actually hasn't tested, but his daughter has, so he's put in there. And some of these I know I can figure out based on shared matches that this Scott is descended from this couple. And that this Hillary doesn't match these people here, but she matches my first cousins. So she needs to be on my grandmother's side of the family because she doesn't match the people on my grandfather's side of the family. Does this make sense to everybody? How, it takes some working through. And when I talk about third-party tools, I will talk about auto clustering that does some of this for you. Although Ancestry's been a party pooper and won't let them use their results. And so you end up doing it the old-fashioned way, which for me is Post-it notes on the wall as I work out the clusters. So even though both of my parents died before autosomal testing was readily available, by having aunts and cousins who've tested, I'm able to then use them to figure out further out with the second, third, fourth cousins, which side of the family somebody's on. So that brings us up to relatives. And this is where, the ethnicity is fun, but this is where the real interesting stuff for genealogists is. So anyhow, this is the front page. This is a snippet of the front page of the Ancestry DNA site. We've talked about this. I'm going to talk about through lines when we get to tools. It's got some problems, but it can also be very helpful. This is what I'm going to concentrate on today is matches. So this is what you get. Whoops. This is the top of my brother's matches. I tested him there. This is my dad's sister. So I also manage her results. Obviously, this is the tree I uploaded. And these are all close enough. These 3 have trees and they're close enough that it shows where our connection is. You don't always get that. So this is my aunt, this is her daughter. And because it's the generation further away, you get the DNA amount dropping in half. So my brother and aunt match at 1,711 centimorgans. And then my brother and cousin match at 833. Now, if I'd gone into my aunt's page, this number for, she would match Kathy most closely and then my brother. And it would be close to the 3,500 centimorgans. And as you can see, you have more segments the closer you get. The other thing that's nice here is these dots, you can add people to groups. So Anne and Robert, I happen to know, again, I looked, I checked, I already knew who Robert was. So this yellow dot tells me that they are matches for each other. And this light purple dot is a Jameson cluster. And anyone with this is descended from my great grandparents. On my dad's side of the family. You can also star people you want to remember. You can also add notes that will show up over here that only you can see. So if you want to put comments about, message they didn't reply, or messaged and they were rude, things like that, or, I'm a hypothesis about who they are. Let's say I wasn't sure who Anne was. I could put a note here saying, I think she's so-and-so's daughter. So this is the sort of thing you get. So going into what I did here is I clicked on Robert and went through to the page directly comparing my brother and Robert. And again, you get a repeat of the centimorgans and the relation and segments. You get the groups here. Here's where you would add a note. You'd click on this and add it. It shows where our trees connect. And then over here, it shows the surnames in green are ones that are in both our trees. And one reason I chose him is my grandmother's maiden name was Poor and his grandmother's maiden name was Poor, but we're only like 8th or 9th cousins through the Poors. And so that really has no impact on our DNA. It's too far out. So you want to be careful and don't assume that if the name is in green, that's where your connection is. I have a couple on my dad's side of the family where I've worked out the relationship, and then elsewhere on the tree, there are McGee's or Ralstons, and that's not where, they're common enough names that's not where the connection is. So this is the trees here. This would, if I clicked through it, would tell me Robert's ethnicity results. And then the shared matches is what you really want to look at. Those are the people that match both my brother and Robert. And it will tell you, the one thing you realize is Ancestry only tells you shared matches if the person shares 20 centimorgans with both, for in this example, both my brother and Robert. So if there's somebody at 19 centimorgans matching both of these, they won't show up in the shared matches. The date, and some of this is just limitations on data crunching. So anyway, it shows you can click through on that left panel and it shows you the relationship. And this is right. I had known this before he showed up. One thing to note on these surnames is that, on the record side, they're really good about lumping alternate spellings together. They've gotten better on the DNA side, but you still sometimes see something like this, where these three and this one are essentially the same surname. And that these two down here are essentially the same. So just keep that in mind on the DNA side. It may not pick up name variations as well as the record side does. Moving to 23andMe, this is that same first matches page. And again, you can see the people who end up in the family tree, and they do percentage shared rather than centimorgans. But it's the same principle. The higher the percentage, the more closely you're related. And as you can see, it on average, the number of segments drops. You have a couple cases where you go 12, 11, 8, and then 9, 3, 4, 2. But on average, it's a downward cycle. They let you star people you want to make sure you remember, because when you start getting into hundreds of matches, you may not remember who you wanted to go back to. They do have a notes page, but you have to click through to get to it. So anyhow, looking at this, I know that Ginny and Rosalind are on my dad's side of the family. So I gave them an orange arrow. This is the same Robert I've been talking about. So I know that this is my mother's mother. And this Scott and this Amy match each other on my mother's side. And so I can then go in, say, click on Wendy. And if she matches Scott and Amy, I know that she's on my mother's side. And if Harrison matches Robert, I know he's on my mother's father's side. And this is the meat of what you want to do the DNA for as a genealogist. The ethnicity is fun, but it's working through these to figure out who's clustered and see if you then find somebody that gives you a hint to somebody further back on the line. So here's looking at my cousin Ginny. Down here, we're first cousins. Down here, the purple is where we share chromosome, where we share DNA across the chromosomes. There are a couple where we don't share any, like there's nothing on 12 and 13. On the other hand, chromosome 10, we got mostly intact. So my father and her mother got this mostly intact from one of their parents and then passed it on to us mostly intact. Where some of these others, you can see it's kind of chopped up. If you look at a second cousin, you can see how much less there is. And oops, Scout, that didn't help. And then when you look at a third cousin, it's less. And I then put them all on the same one, same slide. So you can see it goes down pretty rapidly. And so what happens is after third cousins, there are a lot of people that you are related to where you will not share DNA. But if you are up to about the third cousin level, there's a 90% chance or better you're going to match. And if your second cousins are closer, it's an almost 100% chance. You know, it's a really rare, unusual case if you don't out to second cousins. So what this means is if you are expecting a first cousin because both of you tested at the same place, and that person doesn't come up on your matches, there's a problem. One of you probably has a parent that you're not expecting. But if fourth cousins don't match, that's not that big a problem. You could well still be related. You just didn't happen to inherit the same little bits of DNA from your shared ancestor. So this is a table showing the three big companies. And as you can see, basically all three of them are saying that if you're a second cousin or closer, 99% or better chance you're going to match. At third cousin, you're looking 90% or better. Fourth cousin, let's say 50%, just to give it a number, down to about 25% for fifth cousins and less than 10% for sixth cousins. But what happens is it's the opposite of pedigree collapse, that you will get possibly hundreds of matches, at the sixth cousin or greater because the number of people is so great, but you in reality probably have 10 times as many people at that relationship level. It's just you're only getting about 10% of them sharing DNA with you. Does this make sense to people? What's happening? That when you get out to the edges, if somebody's, if you and a fourth cousin don't match, it doesn't mean that there's been a non-paternity event, a not parent expected event. It may just mean you haven't inherited the same chunk of DNA. But this is also where having siblings, cousins, aunts, uncles test is helpful, because let's say we're looking at a fifth cousin and my brother isn't one of the 15% who matches with the fifth cousin because they didn't get the DNA that matches, but I did because we got slightly different DNA from our dad. Well, I can then use that to work at the, at the couple greats grandparents level, figuring out who that would be. Ancestry calls them shared matches. 23andMe calls them relatives in common. It's the same thing. And again, you look here and Scott is my second cousin and Amy's first cousin. Susan is my third cousin and Amy's fourth cousin. And so with doing some of this, you can work through to figure out the relationships here. This is how they put together that family tree that I showed you from 23andMe, is they're looking at this and the computer is figuring out the relationships. So this is a wonderful site. It's called the Shared Centimorgan Project. It's housed at DNA Painter, although it's technically not DNA Painter. If you Google Shared Centimorgan Project, this will be the first result. And what this is doing is you have a relationship. This is you, and you have the possible relationships with people. And then you have the predicted amount of DNA you're going to share with that person. So for example, remember my brother and my aunt shared 1,711 centimorgans. The average predicted is 1,741, but the range is 1,200 to 2,300 centimorgans. So he fits really nicely right in the middle of that. My brother and I come out at about, I forget exactly what it is, but it's enough that we're definitely full siblings. But you can see here that, and this is one of the other things that trips people up, is these services will sometimes make a prediction about the relationship. And the one that has really tripped some people up is notice that there is overlap between sibling and half sibling. If somebody's at the high end of a half sibling match, it's at the low end of a sibling. And so I've had people come in and say, Ancestry saying we're half siblings because they're at, the 1800, but, I'm pretty sure we're full siblings. And we look at the data, they're at like 1,710. And so they're at the low end of sibling, but so that they really are siblings and not half siblings. So, they're, the DNA testing companies are making predictions based on this type of data. But as you can see, there is some variation. So what's nice about this is if you go to this website, you can put in the number of centimorgans you and the person you're interested in share, or you can click here and enter the percentage if that's what you have from DNA 23andMe. They give you a predictions of the most likely things. And then below this on the page, they give you this. This is that chart. And they've sort of shadowed or grayed out, I put in 206 centimorgans. So these are the relationships it could be. I could be with somebody who shares 206 centimorgans. So, we can't be siblings or half siblings, or even a half niece and nephew, but it could be a first cousin once removed, second cousin once removed, and so on. So this is a really handy tool, especially when you don't know who somebody is, to try to figure out how they could fit in your tree. Because sometimes, you can figure out, well, this person really isn't, they're younger than I am. So the chances that they're a couple, 3 generations above me, and I don't know who they are pretty small. But, them being a third cousin that I don't know about could be the case. And again, Ancestry does not have this. It's one of the big weaknesses of Ancestry. But the other services have what's called a chromosome browser. And what this did is I took myself and these 5 people, and this is comparing where I share DNA with these people. And the people I'm more closely related to, like Virginia, there's more here than this olivey one that's Robert. And this is another view of this. This is actually comparing Ginny's niece, her sister's daughter, to Ginny and to me. And you can see that there's a big difference in how much we share with her niece, and it's reflected here. There's a lot more purple that Ginny and her niece share than I share with her niece as a first cousin once removed. And so that's reflected in, and you can see where all 3 of us overlap. And what you can do, now this is hard because we all descend from our grandparents. But if I did this with a second cousin, where I knew which side of the family they were on, I could figure out, well, I had to have gotten this segment from that grandparent side of the family. You have to go back a generation. So to figure out what Ginny and I inherited from our grandparents, we'd have to go back to matching through their parents, our great grandparents. So here's an interesting case. This is a family I'm descended from. Elizabeth Miller is my several greats grandmother. And she and 3 of her siblings very nicely died in 1855 or later in Scotland, which means they had fairly complete death records, because that's the year civil registration started in Scotland. And all 4 of these people had William Miller and Helen Douglas on their death records as their parents. And I'd originally just found Elizabeth's, and there's always the possibility that, in fact, it's frequently the case that a mother's maiden name is wrong, especially when the informant in this case was one of Elizabeth Miller's grandchildren, who would have never known her great grandparents. And so it was nice to find these other 3 children. I'm guessing there were others in the family, because the only records I found before the 1841 census are a marriage record for these 2. I have not found any baptisms for the children. So I have born abouts based on census and death records. But William and Helen were married in 1785. Helen came along the next year. And then there's an 8-year gap until Elizabeth, and then 2 years till James, and then another 8-year gap until Mary. So I'm guessing there are other children that did not survive until 1855. So it turns out I went through the matches that go back to these people. Some of them were predicted by Ancestry. Others I looked at because they were shared, they were shared matches with somebody who was predicted by Ancestry. I ended up with 47 people between my brother's results and my aunt's who are almost certainly descended from this couple. I could not trace all of them directly because the records just aren't available. 100-year privacy laws and lack of records before 1855. But I was able, going through this, and notice a lot of these are these 20 and 30 some matches. You can see I've given them all the color-coded dot that they are descended from this couple. Here you can see what I did here is if there's a connection that's pretty clear, I did this as the note. And if it's just based on shared matches, I put shared matches. But this was one I was able to to do some tracing on. But I just pulled up, you can narrow down to just the group that's my Miller Douglas matches. And here's one you can see, here's the relationship. Again, I did a very quick and dirty double checking this to the best I could. These couple generations I couldn't really because of privacy laws and such, but I was able to get up to Bruce's birth to see that these, at least on the surface, appear right. And I'm pretty sure that my line is right because I've been working on it for 25 years and I really hope it's right. And here again, these are looking at and you can see the notes here, linked tree and so on. Linked tree means that it's linked and you can go in and see where people are on it. The unlinked tree is they've got a DNA result, but they haven't connected the DNA result to a particular person on the tree, but you can still look at the tree. You can click through to their profile and look at it. Whereas this one, you just click through and you're at the tree. So it's an extra step to get to the unlinked tree. So anyhow, this is what I ended up with. So for these 4 siblings, I was able to come up with 18 matches where I can, with reasonably good certainty, say that they're descended from the 4 siblings who are the children of this couple. And so that's actually, and the DNA comes out about where it should for our relationships. And it's now the other, all the others out of that 47, I have not been able to do this. I think they either, I haven't gotten enough 20th century connections, or I'm pretty sure they descend from siblings who didn't survive long enough to have the death records for me to know that they were part of this family. Because as I said, I have not found their baptismal records yet. I need to keep looking. But this was kind of a weak paper trail because, particularly with mine, the informant was a grandson, I think, I think it was a grandson-in-law. And so I didn't know whether he had it right for her last name, but having done all of this and having all of these matches, I'm pretty sure that this woman does fit into this family. Does this make sense to everybody how I did this? it took a couple months of digging, I will tell you that. But it's really helpful because now if I get a new match at Ancestry and it matches all of these matches, I can just say, yep, that's another Miller Douglas one, put the little gold dot next to it, and know that it's probably not going to help me with any of my unknowns because this is the couple they descended from. This is much harder in, say, French Canadian families where you have a lot of endogamy, Ashkenazi Jewish, because again, you have lots of people who are fourth, fifth, sixth cousins, lots of different ways. But when you have a family that was not from a background like that, and is not from a small island with a small population, this can be really helpful. And so, as I said, this has taken a weak paper trail with, one death record that I wasn't certain about, and a marriage record from 1785. And then the other 3 death records I eventually found. That's it for what I've got for this family, pretty much, other than some 1841 and later censuses. But I'm pretty sure this is now a fairly strong paper trail because the DNA has somewhat confirmed it. So next week, I'm going to talk about through lines at Ancestry, and then I'm going to start in on the third-party tools, which help you with things like, what happens if you tested at Ancestry and your second cousin tested at 23andMe. Yes, there's a service you can use to compare across that. It also has a chromosome browser that you can use because Ancestry won't provide one. A company called Genetic Affairs does auto clustering, so you can do this, a lot of this work. You pay a couple bucks, you allow them access to your data, and half an hour later, you get a nice little email saying, here are these clusters of people who were related to each other, the way I have the Millers that I had to do by hand because it was from Ancestry, and Ancestry is not letting Genetic Affairs use their data. And then DNA Painter is where you look at shared matches and which couple you're descended from and painting those onto a chromosome browser, digitally painting them on so that you're able to figure out which bits of DNA you got from which ancestors. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Yeah, there's the higher the centimorgans, that has nothing to do with physical resemblance. My aunt and I look very, I could show you a picture of me and a picture of her at 9 years old. And the only way you could tell us apart is that my dad's a teenager in one and a middle-aged man with a bit of a beer belly in the other. But she actually shares more DNA with my brother than she does with me. So that's one of those interesting quirks that it's not a lot, but it's, she has about, they share like 75 centimorgans more than she and I share. But it's a funny little quirk that the aunt that I look like, and then her daughters take after her husband, my uncle. And so when I've been out with her, people thought we were mother and daughter when, her daughters look like their dad, but I look like my dad and my dad's sister. So
we're not seeing you, BJ.
Oh, thank you. Sorry, I forgot to. Okay, so any other questions? I've really tried to simplify this enough to show you what you actually need to know and understand to use the data. So I hope I succeeded.
I'm really glad that you mentioned places where people either legally aren't allowed to test or tend to very much prefer not to, because that's a lot of people don't realize that. And also, I think too, I don't know how it is over in Asia, and because I know Ancestry probably tends to be primarily US, well, North America and Europe centric in terms of who's testing, and all that sort of thing will also impact
Yes,
what people are getting for results. So I'm not so up to date or sure what's going on with how things are with the Asian Eastern countries.
they've been working on that, and it's gotten a lot better in the last 3 to 4 years. 5 years ago, there wasn't much data. It was kind of really hit or miss, but the companies also realized that, they need to keep expanding who tests to sell new tests. And if the data for Asia is not good, they're not going to sell tests in Asia. And since that's probably where there's money for people to test.
Yeah. Now, are any of those countries reluctant?
I don't know enough
either
about
the
that.
people or the government.
I don't know enough to know that off the top of my head.
Okay.
I know that it was about 3 or 4 years ago, they were looking for people to test, and at least one of the companies was offering free tests in parts of Asia to build up their database, because another one was selling here and marketing heavily to people who were Asian, because I remember sending something to my 100% Mongolian sister-in-law. I don't know if she ever tested, but I sent it to her saying, if you're interested, they were offering a really good price to people who had, again, grandparents born within a 25-mile circle. So they're working at it. And there's been a lot of scientific study of Africa and the Americas. There's been a lot, there have been academic papers written on those populations. And how much of that has already filtered down to the databases? I think it has, at least for some of the African populations. Okay, let me get, someone wants this. The link to the centimorgan. So let me get that and put it in the chat. Actually, since that doesn't have privacy issues, let me share my screen on that. So here's this. Okay, where did chat go? There it is. I'll put it in chat as well. And as I said, so let's say you get a test result of 531. I put it in here. You see, you get the percentage. These are probabilities. And then down here, you see how it grayed out. And if I go up here and take this out, you get the full chart. And it's quite helpful. I use this frequently. But as I said, it's at the DNA Painter website, and I am going to talk about DNA Painter before we finish this series. I admit, I was one of the beta readers for version 4.0 of this. So that's just my disclaimer that I helped out that little bit with double checking, not this, but the some of the how to use it instructions and explanations.
It
I
is really helpful, especially because once you have an amount entered and it grades out all the non-possible ones, and some of the ones that are showing as possibilities, it's actually pretty easy to rule them out depending on
Yeah.
maybe the age or something.
Right. And it's, as I said, I like it because the all of this DNA companies are making estimates and they sometimes get it wrong. And this is where I go in when a patron comes in and says, that says we're, second cousins, but we're really third cousins, what's going on? And I can go in and show them that there's this overlap. And, at say 180 and they've just made a guess, and, don't panic. A lot of people, have not dealt with anything sciencey since high school, and then they get their DNA tested and they try to understand it and they panic. And that's when they come in to see me. So this is a really helpful tool. There are other versions of this. The International Society for Genetic Genealogy, which is isogg.org. Has all sorts of other stuff as well. And has a lot. I mean, you can see, but this is interesting information, but for practical uses, you want to go to the Shared Centimorgan project. But if they have a really helpful glossary, and all sorts of other fun stuff here that will, if you really get into this is worth going to this page, and they've got the wiki, and then they've got their website that has links to all sorts of other things like scientific papers and things like that can be very helpful. Basically, I'm going to put together a bibliography, and give it to you guys next week on this stuff, because it's hard, because on one hand, there are a couple really good books, but things are also outdated as soon as they're printed. So knowing about the wiki here that is updated as things change is really helpful. So yeah, and so if you have signed up from the website for genealogy notifications, I will probably I haven't done adding people for a week or so now, because we've been really busy with behind the scenes work at the library. So in the next few days, I will add everyone who signed up, and you'll get an email. And if you don't get one by next Thursday afternoon, email me, because I am having some things bounce. One of the things I'm wanting to do now that we're done with interviews for the open position that took lots of time. And I'll put my email address in the chat as well. I am probably going to switch from just using Office to using a mail service that will make it easier to subscribe and unsubscribe. And I'll be able to do some fancier things. And right now I actually have to, every time I send out an email to all of you, I send it out twice because my list is about 650 people, and Outlook has a hard limit of 500 people that can be sent an email at a time. And so I need to do everything twice. And I've decided that I'm going to use a service and be done with it, because the signing up gets to, I don't mind doing it in the sense of I want more people getting things and coming to programs and such. But on the other hand, I'd rather spend the time on putting together programs than fiddling with an email list. So, okay, any other questions? I will put this up at YouTube because I know it's a lot, and if you want to go back over it, and I will also, and I'll send out a link at some point to that, to this series, and I will put the slides up at the blog. So if you just want to look at the slides, you'll be able to do that instead of having to watch the program. And finally, before I say goodbye, there will be special programming on Mondays in March, because I couldn't resist calling them Mondays in March. So I figure that March is a dreary month often here in Maine, and it's can't decide whether it's winter or spring, and it's raining, and it's not as gray as it was, but it's still not really light, and so on. So I figured I'd do extra stuff on Mondays in March.
Thank you.
Keep me sane as well as providing information to you guys. So I think that'll be fun. So anyway, next week, through lines at Ancestry and how it's good and how it's bad. And then I'll start in on the third-party tools that are for those of us who really geek out over this stuff. And I won't cover everything with those, but I'll show you the basics of what they do so that you feel you have a start. And thank you all for showing up. I appreciate it greatly. And if you're here in Maine, stay warm and dry tomorrow. I guess it's going to snow again.
Nice,
Not
thank
really,
you.
not really news in February in Maine, but yeah. So anyway, take care, and I'll talk to you guys again next week.
You too. Thanks, PJ.
Thanks,
Bye. Thank
See you
you.
next week.
See you next week.
Bye, everybody.
Pat those kitties.
I will.